Hello, everyone. Welcome to the lecture for the Machinery of Government and Public Policy. My name is Monica Gattinger. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa's School of Political Studies and director of the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. My area of specialization is public policy and public administration. So this lecture is something that I really enjoy delivering, sharing with people about how government works and talking about public policy, what it means, how it's made, etc. So our schedule for today is fairly straightforward. We're going to start with some discussion of the machinery of government. Then we're going to move into a discussion of public policy, and then I'll have a few concluding words for everyone. And this lecture is really designed for people who are interested in learning more about how can they help to influence science, society, and policy relations and issues at that intersection. It's so important to understand how government works, what public policy is if you're looking to try to influence government decision-making in those areas. So we're going to start with machinery of government. And you'll see throughout the presentation there are a number of images that I've included of different books, different textbooks that you might find of interest in terms of learning a little bit more about the topic issue. So when it comes to machinery of government, there's an excellent public administration text written by a colleague of mine, David Johnson, at University of Cape Breton, and it's called Thinking Government, Public Administration and Politics in Canada. So I'd highly recommend it for those who might be interested in learning more about public administration and some of the things we're going to be talking about today. So one of the things I always like to do is to start by sharing with people some of the differences between the public and the private sectors. So when it comes to the public sector, of course, this is the realm of public policy. This is about government, and it's quite different from the private sector, where many people do have experience having worked in companies or in the private sector in some capacity. So if you're in the public sector, your overall mission and purpose is really about the public interest and about serving the public. And so one of the sort of interesting issues with that is that the way one person might define the public interest can be different the way another person might define the public interest. And that's really important to know because it kind of opens up our eyes to the fact that when it comes to government decision making and making decisions in the public interest, there's a lot of debate and discussion about what governments should do and what ultimately is in the best interests of society. The operating environment of the private versus the public sector is also quite different. So if you're in the private sector, you're really concerned about the profit, you're in market economy, it's largely, private sector interests. If you're in the public sector, you're in the realm of democracy, right? This is the public sphere, it's political, there's a lot more focus on transparency, access to information, all of these issues that we commonly associate with democracy and democratic decision-making. The goals in the public sector are also relatively complex compared to the private sector. So in the private sector, your goals are relatively simple, predominantly economic. In the public sector, though, you've got a multiplicity of goals that governments are trying to pursue: economic goals, social goals, political goals, environmental goals, and the like. In the public versus the private sector, the different kinds of goods and services and kind of beneficiaries or targets of those goods and services also are quite different. The public sector is serving everyone, right? So everybody from citizens to corporations to non-government organizations. And the kind of services that are provided are often public goods or services, things that perhaps the market economy does not provide or does not provide adequately. The final difference I'd like to point to on this slide relates to the criteria of success. How do you measure if you're doing well in the public versus the private sector? In the private sector, again, it's relatively simple. Is the company profitable? In the public sector, it's quite challenging to measure because you've got a lot of different kinds of goods and services. Economic considerations are only one consideration, so it's much more complex in terms of measuring the criteria of success. A few other key differences between the public and private sectors relate to accountability relationships and the dominant drivers and values that underpin each of these sectors. So again, in the private sector, accountability relationships are relatively straightforward. First and foremost, there are accountability relationships to owners of the company, to shareholders of the company. Increasingly, of course, we're seeing companies taking accountability with respect to customers, stakeholders, rights holders, and society writ large. In the public sector, this is the bread and butter of what governments are doing, right? The accountability relationships are multiple and complex. Governments are accountable to citizens, to communities, to society, to the electorate, lots of different accountability relationships to think about. And we're going to come back to that in a little bit. Finally, the dominant drivers and values underpinning each of these sectors. In the private sector, the dominant driver, of course, is profit. Firms are thinking about how to be competitive, how to be innovative, how to be efficient and effective in the context of their work. In the public sector, the dominant drivers and values are many and they're complex. And so it can range everything from quality of life to issues of social equity and equality, economic growth of a country, national unity of a country, efficiency, effectiveness, and economy of the delivery of goods and services. So the aim here, with sharing this information is really to try to underscore that when you're operating within the public sector, when you're thinking about what governments do, it's a fairly complex environment. So in Canada, if you think about the machinery of government at the broadest level, and we're going to get into a little bit more detail about each of these areas here, at the broadest level, Canada operates with what's called a Westminster style of government, which means that the country has really borrowed from, taken inspiration from the United Kingdom in terms of its system of government. And so in Canada, we've got three branches of government, just as most governments do: the legislative branch that's responsible for enacting legislation, the executive branch that's responsible for executing on pieces of legislation and implementing them in the real world, and then of course the judicial branch that is responsible for litigating various legal disagreements over what the government is doing. What's distinctive about the Canadian context is that the executive branch of government is fused with the legislative branch of government. So you can see here on the slide, we've got a couple of the boxes that are straddling the legislative and the executive branches. So in Canada, our legislature, so the House of Commons and the Senate, has not only politicians in it from opposition parties, but it has politicians in it from the party that has formed government, and it has politicians in it that are members of the cabinet. And so this fusion of the executive and legislative branches of government is really important when it comes to understanding how government works, because it means that in a Westminster system of government, if you're a party that has the majority of seats in the House of Commons, you are virtually guaranteed the capacity to enact your legislative agenda, right? So the folks who are bringing forward pieces of legislation to be debated upon and ultimately voted upon by the House of Commons are coming from the government, right? So it is the Prime Minister and Cabinet that are bringing forward the vast majority of pieces of legislation. And if they have a majority of seats in the House of Commons, they are virtually assured that piece of legislation will be enacted. And that's quite different from many other kinds of government, including the United States, where you've got much more distinct branches of government, separation of powers between the president and the executive branch of government, with the legislative branch of government and the judicial branch. The final thing I want to point out to you in this slide is the public service, so the very bottom box here. And we're going to be spending a little bit of time talking about the public service, because in Canada's system of government, the public service is part of the executive, right? So it's working there on behalf of and supporting the actions of the Prime Minister and of the Cabinet, so of the government of the day. And it's exclusively part of the executive branch of government, there to support the executive. And we'll get into in a moment a little bit more about what that means. But before we do that, wanted to spend a little bit of time. A lot of this presentation focuses predominantly on the federal level of government. We'll speak a little bit about the provincial levels of government as well, but predominantly the federal government. And in Canada, it's so important to be very conscious of the fact that we are a federation, which means that you've got a constitution that brings together both federal and provincial levels of government, and they each have distinct areas of jurisdiction in the Constitution. And so if you think about the federal government and the provincial government, you'll see on the left-hand part of the slide, the federal government, and these are just a few examples of areas of federal jurisdiction: the capacity to make international treaties, responsibility for defense, responsibility for banking and the money supply. But in Canada, the provincial levels of government also have some very important areas of jurisdiction that include health, that include education, that include many aspects of energy. And so there are some areas of constitutional jurisdiction, as is noted on the bottom part of the slide in the right-hand corner, some areas of jurisdiction that are shared. And so there's sharing of powers in the environmental sphere. In fact, the environment was not contemplated in Canada's Constitution when it was first created in 1867. So various matters of the environment are shared between the federal and provincial governments. Various matters of agriculture, of science, are shared between both levels of government. So you'll see here on this slide, on the right-hand side, we have our current Prime Minister Mark Carney, and on the left-hand side, all of the premiers. And so the Prime Minister has, many, many sources of power. As was noted a moment ago, he, in this case, and his party and his cabinet, because of Canada's system of government, even though at present we're in a minority government situation, there is still, because it's a very strong minority government, there's still a substantial capacity for the government of the day to bring forward pieces of legislation and have those be enacted by the legislature. The Prime Minister also has many, many sources of power in terms of the power of appointment, to appoint, a variety of different heads of agencies, of boards, of commissions, to appoint a variety of cabinet ministers. So there's lots of powers in the hands of the Prime Minister. But there are lots of limits on the Prime Minister's powers as well. Of course, one of those, and probably one of the most important and underestimated ones, is time. So if you're the Prime Minister, you can only spend so much time on different topic areas, and so you need to focus your efforts on key priorities and delegate, make sure that other folks are working, other members of cabinet and others are working on delivering on other issues. It's important, too, in Canada to maintain national unity. And this is something because we are a country with many regional differences, because we have provinces with fairly substantial levers of power in their hands through our Constitution. If you're the Prime Minister, making sure that you're fostering national unity on an ongoing basis also is a bit of a limit on the Prime Minister's power in terms of making sure to navigate national unity in the country. Same thing goes for public opinion. Any politician can't get too far offside of public opinion on any matter of public policy, on any political issue. They need to be thinking about where's the public's head on these issues. So all of this to say, in Canada's system, and we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail in a bit, the Prime Minister has a substantial amount of power. The federal government has a substantial amount of power in terms of public policy, but it's not unlimited. There are many limits on those powers. So if we think about, how do governments make decisions? And this goes to the whole topic of machinery of government. So at the head of each government is, at the federal and provincial levels, either a Prime Minister or premiers. And then each of those governments also have what are called cabinets. And so a cabinet is a key policy decision making body. And so it's formed of politicians, elected politicians that are members of the House of Commons, in the case of the federal government. And they are selected by the Prime Minister to be a member of the federal cabinet. And, this is a really important power on the part of the Prime Minister to have. And, if you're a politician, most politicians are really keen to be members of cabinet because it means that you are much closer to the center of decision making for the government. It's also important to note that, it is the Prime Minister that decides not only who will be in cabinet, but also who will not be in cabinet. So the Prime Minister is responsible for the selection and the removal of members of cabinet. So again, this sort of goes back to, if you're the Prime Minister, lots of levers of power in your hands. There are various priority setting mechanisms that cabinets have. A number of key milestones and events. And so if you are somebody who's interested in public policy, who's interested in the machinery of government, how decisions get made, these are the sorts of things you want to be really making sure that you're keeping your eye on. One of which is the speech from the throne. So the speech from the throne is read by the Governor General at the opening of every new session of Parliament. But while it's read by the Governor General, it is, or in the case of our last speech from the throne, it was read by the King of Canada, King Charles. In the case of the speech from the throne, it's written by the government of the day. And so that's, it's laying out what the government's priorities are and will be over the course of that session of Parliament. And so that is a really important document in terms of laying out, these are the priorities of the government. This is where they're going to be spending their time and attention. And so if you're interested in a particular topic area that isn't featured in the speech from the throne, it might be a little bit harder to get attention for big changes in that area. The budget is also another key milestone. And so the budget is laying out, what are the key spending priorities for the government. Generally, budgets are issued sometime early in the first part of the calendar year. In 2025, we had a federal election. There have been some shifts in when things are happening, and so the federal budget will actually be released in the fall of 2025. But generally what we're seeing is budgets that are released in the first quarter of a calendar year. Cabinets also meet on a regular basis. They have planning sessions, and so they're really, coming together on a very regular basis to make important decisions for the government of the day. The final thing to note, or a key piece of priority setting for cabinets, is what's called a memorandum to cabinet. And this is a document that a cabinet minister brings forward when they are seeking the support of their cabinet colleagues for a new initiative or a major change in public policy. Memoranda to cabinet are not generally made public, and as we're going to be talking about in a moment, even the conversations that take place in cabinet are not generally made public. But there are very good reasons for that, as we're about to see in a moment. So if you are a minister, so you have been appointed to cabinet, you have been assigned a particular portfolio, what are some of the responsibility and accountability relationships that you have? So if you are the minister, let's say you are the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada, you've got individual responsibility and accountability for your portfolio. So let's say in the House of Commons during question period, there are some questions about things that are happening in your portfolio. You're the individual who's going to be called upon to answer those questions and to be responsible for whether it's good things or bad things happening in your portfolio. But ministers as a whole have what's called collective responsibility for the overall operation of government. And what that means, if you're a member of cabinet, there's a thing called cabinet solidarity, which means that whatever decisions that cabinet makes, that you need to support those decisions. And if you're unable to support those decisions, the expectation is that you would step down from cabinet. So ministers are collectively responsible and accountable for the overall operations of government. From a machinery of government perspective, it's important to be aware of what's called the minister's office. So every minister has an office, and it is staffed by political appointees. So generally, these are people that the minister knows, often has worked with the minister very closely in getting them elected in previous positions, individuals that are there to support the minister as a politician and to help inform his or her or their decision making in the context of trying to ensure their ongoing political support. And so it's important, if you are engaging with government, to know the difference between engaging with the minister's office, where you're going to be dealing with political staff who are going to be bringing a partisan political lens to issues, versus dealing with the members of the public service, where they're bringing a non-political lens, a non-partisan lens to their issues. It's going to be a different kind of a conversation. It's important also to draw the distinction between ministers and deputy ministers. So ministers, as we've been talking about, they're the political head of a department. Deputy ministers, even though the title suggests that there's some kind of political role, they are not politicians. Deputy ministers are part of the public service, and they are the administrative head of the department. So they would be nonpartisan and neutral. And so this brings us to, so the public service, what is its role in that broader machinery of government? So Canada has what's referred to as a permanent, nonpartisan public service. So members of the public service are politically neutral, right? So they are expected to provide forthright, objective advice to the government of the day about different areas of public policy. They are expected to be loyal in their efforts, and in fact, many public servants would pride themselves on the fact that the advice and execution of decisions taken by one government might be the things that they then are reversing under a subsequent government. So the public service is intended to be serving the government of the day. For those who work in the public service, there's this distinction that is drawn between sort of politics and policy as being separate from administration, right? So if you're a member of the public service, you're not a politician, you're not an elected official, you're there to provide that objective, nonpartisan advice about a particular area of public policy, but also to then execute on whatever decision that the government takes. What this means then is that, if you're a public servant, there are relatively limited partisan political activities that you're able to engage in. This has been relaxed, substantially over the years, but the aim is to really underscore that the public service is a nonpartisan body. Another aspect of being a public servant is that the expectation is that individual public servants will not provide kind of public or personal comment assessing policies or decisions taken by the government. So if you were to ask a public servant, well, what do you think about the government's decision on, X? They will probably dance around that question and not answer it for you directly, because they are respecting the fact that the public service is a nonpartisan, professional, objective entity. So because the public service is this permanent nonpartisan entity, the vast majority of positions in the public service, the appointments are based upon merit, right? There are very few jobs in the public service that are political appointments. The vast majority of positions are jobs where if a new government comes into power, you still have your job, and when there's a competition for a job, those decisions are taken based on merit. And as we noted earlier, ministers are responsible and accountable for what happens within their departments. Another big piece of the machinery of government that's important for folks who are interested in that science-society policy relationship to be aware of is the role of what are called central agencies. And these exist both at the federal level and provincial levels. They're referred to with slightly different names federally and provincially. We're going to be speaking about the central agencies at the federal level, but similar bodies exist at the provincial level as well. So central agencies, their role is to provide some level of coordination across government. So they're trying to work to prevent overlap and working at cross purposes across government. They try to foster a certain level of standardization and uniformity. So that's sort of their administrative role. But they also have really important policy roles. So they're another source of information and advice to the Prime Minister and Cabinet on decisions that the government is taking. And they also play a really important role shepherding policy through decision-making and implementation. So you'll get a better sense of what we mean by this in a minute when we get into what some of these key central agencies are. And at the federal level, there are four that I'll be bringing to your attention. So the first two are the Prime Minister's Office and the Privy Council Office. And you can think about these two agencies as sort of, in a sense, two sides of a coin. So the Prime Minister's Office is there to serve the Prime Minister as a politician. So this is an entity that is overtly partisan. So in contrast to just about every other part of the public service, the Prime Minister's Office is really there. It's staffed by folks, particularly at the senior levels, who are overtly partisan. Their role is really to serve the Prime Minister as a politician to try to maximize the capacity for that individual to retain their role as Prime Minister and the party to continue to enjoy the support of Canadians going into a subsequent election. So as the name suggests, it is headed by the Prime Minister. And so you can think about the Prime Minister's Office as, the Prime Minister is also a minister, and this is his office in the case of Prime Minister Mark Carney. There are a number of key positions in the Prime Minister's Office, the Chief of Staff and the Principal Secretary. Both of these roles, and I've included images of the current Chief of Staff and Principal Secretary, both of these roles are really, again, there to serve the Prime Minister when it comes to providing really high-level advice and support on key government priorities. The other side of the coin is the Privy Council Office. So the Privy Council Office is part of the public service, and you could think about this as the Prime Minister's department. So every minister has a department. Well, the Prime Minister has a department, and it is called the Privy Council Office. So it's serving the Prime Minister as head of government, right? So the Privy Council Office is really, sort of the most senior entity at the level of the public service. So it is a nonpartisan entity as part of the public service, but of course it is politically sensitive. At the end of the day, the PCO and advice it's providing to the Prime Minister is intended to be, nonpartisan, objective advice, but it is politically sensitive to the realities of being a Prime Minister and the political dimension of that. The Privy Council Office also provides leadership of the public service. So it is headed by, and I've included a photo of the current clerk of the Privy Council, so it is headed by the clerk of the Privy Council, who has really three key roles, one of which is to be the head of the public service. So it's the clerk of the Privy Council is the senior-most public servant, and the clerk of the Privy Council is also providing advice to the Prime Minister, and is also ensuring that decision making through cabinet is proceeding. And so it's the clerk of the Privy Council is also secretary of the cabinet. The other two central agencies I want to draw your attention to, again, we can think about them as two sides of a coin, and in this case it's more of a monetary or financial coin, are the Department of Finance and the Treasury Board Secretariat. So the Department of Finance advises the finance minister, so it's headed by the Minister of Finance. More broadly, though, the Department of Finance is also advising the Prime Minister and Cabinet on a whole host of economic policy matters. So everything from, fiscal policy, like how much should the government spend? Should it run a deficit? If so, how much? What should the government's international trade policy be? It's also responsible for providing advice on tax policy. Will a new tax credit be created? If so, what are the conditions going to be? And the Department of Finance also prepares what's called the revenue budget, which is in essence at a macro level, how is the government doing from a financial perspective. The other side of this coin is the Treasury Board Secretariat. And so the Treasury Board Secretariat is the central agency that provides preparatory work for the Treasury Board. The Treasury Board is a committee of cabinet, and it is headed by the president of the Treasury Board, which is a member, who is a member of cabinet. And so, the president of the Treasury Board's department is a central agency called the Treasury Board Secretariat, and it is responsible for providing efficient and effective use of government resources. So it's, if you think about the Department of Finance as providing that sort of macro perspective on how the government's doing in terms of its spending, the Treasury Board Secretariat is really much more about going into the details of, okay, how much is being spent in an individual government department? How do we make sure that all of the financial transactions that government departments are undertaking are being done, in a way that's that's ensuring accuracy and that's audited on an ongoing basis, et cetera. The Treasury Board Secretariat also has is responsible for certain aspects of human resources management and advising the President of the Treasury Board on that. So that brings us to the end of our discussion of machinery of government. And now we're going to move on to talking about public policy. We've been alluding a lot to public policy over the course of the presentation. Now we're going to kind of dive in a little bit more on that front. So if we think about how policy decisions get made by government, folks like myself who study public administration have done a lot of research on this and have really shown that historically and over time, policy decision making has changed quite a bit. So if you were to look at, from about the 1960s to the early 1990s, policy decision making was characterized by what's referred to as an institutionalized cabinet centered on memoranda to cabinet. And so what does that mean? In effect, that means that it was in essence, somewhat of a rational approach to making decision-making, quite a lot of involvement of members of cabinet in decision-making, lots of analysis going into the creation of memoranda to cabinet, and lots of different cabinet committees utilized to make decisions. And we can see a similar history to this at the provincial level. So you can see here the images are the prime ministers of the time from the 1960s to the early 1990s. But that period of the institutionalized cabinet was not to last. So what happened? Well, since the early 1990s, we see a number of new features of policy decision making. And so you can see up in the top left-hand corner of the slide, there's a book that I would highly recommend for anybody who is interested in this called Governing from the Center, written by a public administration scholar, Donald Savoie. And this book really cracked open and shone light on a trend in policy decision-making that emerged in the early 1990s and arguably has intensified since that time. And so governing from the center, and this is a term that gets used frequently, is really about a concentration of power. A concentration of power in the hands of the Prime Minister and a number of key individuals and agencies around the Prime Minister. So that can include central agencies, that can include key advisors, some of those that I mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, the Principal Secretary, the clerk of the Privy Council. And so what we saw emerging in the early 1990s, originally under Prime Minister Chrétien, was use of fewer cabinet committees, much more concentration of power, and what Savoy characterized as sort of command mode. And this really intensified under Prime Minister Harper. So further concentration of power, much greater focus under Prime Minister Harper in terms of controlling and centralizing communications. And I think it's really important to put all of this into historical perspective, because for many folks who are interested in science and evidence-based decision-making and science-society policy relations, they often point to the Harper years as the years where there was really a lot of concentration of power. But Prime Minister Harper was really following in the footsteps of previous trends before his arrival to power. And I think that is important to note. Subsequent to Prime Minister Harper, under Prime Minister Trudeau, the concentration of power continued. Lots of focus on the Prime Minister's office and key advisors to Prime Minister Trudeau in terms of where the locus of decision-making was and who the key individuals and folks were within the machinery of government that were really crucial in terms of making decisions. And I think, you've got the photos here of each of these prime ministers. Under Prime Minister Carney, I think we have yet to see and characterize to what extent this concentration of power continues, and if it does, what specific, spins or characteristics can we distinguish and discern under Prime Minister Carney? So definitely something for those who are interested in policy decision making and how decentralized or centralized that it is. Definitely something to keep your eye on. It's important to note that we see a pretty similar trajectory at the provincial level in terms of that concentration of power. So now we want to spend a little bit of time on public policy. So we talk a lot about, different kinds of policy: science policy, innovation policy, housing policy, climate policy. Like, what do we mean by public policy? So there's another excellent book here that I would suggest to anybody who's interested, authored by Leslie Powell out of Carleton University. It's called Beyond Policy Analysis. And he uses the following definition of public policy: a course of action or inaction chosen by public authorities to address a given problem or interrelated set of problems. And I've underlined here the key parts of that definition. So it's important to note first that public policy can not only be an action that public authorities, in this case governments, choose to take. It can also be an inaction, right? Governments can study a particular area of policy and decide, government involvement here is not needed, and so we're actually not going to be doing anything. And generally, public policy is intended to address a particular problem or an interrelated set of problems. Problems rarely come in neat, tidy, little simple packages. They generally come wrapped up as bundles with multiple interrelated problems and issues. So what are the elements of of public policy? And Les Powell identifies three elements that are really useful when it comes to thinking about analyzing policy. So any area of policy that you're interested in, I would highly encourage you to really try to think about and do a little bit of reading of government documents to try to understand how has the government defined this problem, right? So what do they think the problem is, and what do they think the factors are that are causing that problem? Because that generally is what's going to inform how the government chooses to tackle that problem and what their goals are to try to address it. So we can think about multiple rationales for governments to intervene. Areas where you've got market externalities. So think about damage to the environment as a key example of that, where in the absence of the need to tax or to compensate in some way the damage that's done to the environment by different activities of companies, of individuals, we see all these negative externalities. And so clearly for governments, they need to think through, okay, what's causing this set of problems? What do we need to do to address it? So governments, that whole process of defining a problem is really crucial, because if we think again about way back at the beginning of this presentation where we talked about the public interest, what goals governments then identify with respect to a particular piece of public policy are really crucial in understanding, how might you go about trying to shift what government is doing in a particular area of public policy if you think that policy could be a better policy or a different policy. So there's a lot of debate and discussion and controversy sometimes over how to define a problem and the rationale for government intervention and what objectives governments should be pursuing. The third element of public policy is the instrument. The instruments that are used by governments to try to address the problem and to achieve their goals. And there are multiple different policy instruments that governments can draw on. It's really a fascinating area of public policy. There are so many different ways that governments can try to change things. Often they are categorized by the degree, what's referred to as the degree of state intervention or the degree of coercion. In other words, how compulsory are these instruments when it comes to the kind of behavior that individuals or firms or others have. A book that is just excellent for thinking through this is called Carrots, Sticks, and Sermons, and it's looking at different kinds of policy instruments, with the idea of carrots being things that governments do to try to incentivize behavior. They're not requiring anybody to do anything, but they're just putting in place a carrot to try to incentivize people to change their behavior. Sticks is things that are compulsory, requiring companies or individuals to change their behavior. So, laws that prohibit people from doing different things. And then sermons are really about information. So it's what information, how can we use what's referred to often as moral suasion? How can we provide information to people in a way that will actually help to change their behaviors? So you could think, for example, about the Canada Food Guide, right? So there's information provided there. Nobody's requiring people to change their eating habits, but they're trying to provide them with the information that they need to make better nutrition choices. So if we look at policy instruments, kind of dive into this a little bit more, we can think about an inventory of policy instruments where, as I noted earlier, sometimes governments choose to do nothing in an area of public policy. They study an area, they say, you know what, we don't think that government involvement, government intervention is required here. I would say, prior to COVID, that policy inaction was often the starting point. The sort of default was, show me that government action is actually required. I think we've shifted post-COVID towards an environment where governments are much more willing to engage and get involved and intervene when there are problems in society or the economy. So that's doing nothing. Second category, acting indirectly. And so what that means is, in effect, pursuing objectives, policy objectives through the actions of citizens, of NGOs and firms. And this is where the carrots, sticks, and sermons piece fits in, right? So we talked about sermons being information, carrots being money, and sticks being law and regulation. The other thing that governments can do, and we see this increasingly, particularly post-COVID, is that governments can act directly. And what that means is using state resources and organizational capacity to change conditions or to directly provide services. And so this is where we have, corporations that are owned by the government, agencies that the government owns, provision of public services, so acting directly to try to change societal or environmental or economic outcomes. So this brings us to the end of the lecture, And, the concluding words, sort of the thoughts I'd like to leave with people is that, for those who are interested in understanding or influencing policies at the intersection of science, society, and policy, it's really important to understand the machinery of government. Who to contact about what, where different individuals sit in the system, kind of what their span of control is, what the lens is that they bring to their work is really important. So the kind of conversation you might have with a public servant versus the kind of conversation you might have with somebody who works in a minister's office is going to be different, right? Somebody who works in the minister's office is going to be bringing a partisan political lens to the issues, is likely to have much more ready access to the minister. And, on the one hand, you could say, well, why wouldn't we always just work with people in the minister's office? Because they, at the end of the day, policy is what the minister says it is. But working with the public service is really important as well. Many policy issues to really make change, it takes years to make those changes. And so developing relationships with individuals who work in the public service, who are going to be there even if there's a change of government, because we have this permanent nonpartisan public service, is really valuable as well. There are some outstanding, highly knowledgeable individuals within the public service. So really working both of those levels is important. Understanding public policy and policy decision making is also really crucial, right? So as we've talked about, policy decision making tends to be pretty centralized, and it's shaped by many, many factors. It's common for people coming from the natural sciences and engineering to sort of think of policy as kind of an input-output model, right? What you take whatever the research says, and that's what you should do. Well, it is so much more complex than that. For governments making decisions in any area of public policy, as we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, they have multiple considerations to take into account, from national unity to economic issues to equity, a whole host of considerations. And those all find their way into policy decision making. And so that means it's really important to look for windows of opportunity and to build coalitions to influence policy. There are often, windows of opportunity where governments are looking to make change in a particular area. That's the time where it's really valuable to see, that is a moment to try to make some change, and to work with others where you've got like-minded interests to try to influence and shape public policy. And then finally, it's important to think about, which instruments are the best instruments to bring to the table. Folks often will sort of think that maybe governments only can bring money to the table, or they can only bring regulation to the table, or they can only do things themselves. It's really important to bear in mind that there are a variety of ways that governments can intervene, and it's important to choose the most appropriate intervention depending upon the nature of the challenge or the problem that they're addressing. So with that, I hope you have enjoyed this lecture on public policy and machinery of government, and I wish you all the best in your future efforts to look at how science-society policy relations fit when it comes to public policy and machinery of government.